My name is Eddie Felmer. I'm a pre-sales engineer at RUCKUS UK. So I look after partner accounts in UK and Ireland. I work with a couple of the partner account managers. So no doubts I haven't had a look. I can't see who the actual participants are in my role here, but no doubt I might have come across one or two of you in my time at RUCKUS, as I've been here for just over 15 years. And today's session is all about securing the network edge from a Wi-Fi perspective. And this is all about really how CloudPath can help to make securing that network edge somewhat simpler in the Wi-Fi world. In terms of some of the key goals of this webinar is, firstly, just setting the scene is that many organizations, and I still see customers that I visit that are still using standard pre-shared keys, so the same pre-shared key for securing either guest access, or securing BYOD access, or securing even employee access, just using the same pre-shared key. So it's something that's still fairly common. You wouldn't think it, but it is still out there, being used by quite a few organizations. And quite often, pre-shared keys may be used in conjunction with a captive portal, sometimes an open networks, a shared key network, and a captive portal to do authentication. So in this session, what I'm going to talk about is how we can actually use some of the features of RUCKUS CloudPath, and these are features that are also available within our Smart Zone Controller Unleashed and Cloud as well. But as you'll see, the granularity isn't as good as what we actually have within CloudPath itself, and we also don't have the onboarding experience available. So what we're going to do is really learn about how we can actually sort of take these PSK networks to the next level using dynamic pre-shared keys. The RUCKUS Dynamic Pre-Shared Keys, it's our own implementation, so it's something we've been doing since the early days of Zone Director. And we're also going to take a look not only at dynamic pre-shared keys, but also if you happen to want to use what's regarded as the gold standard of network authentication, 802.1x. So we'll also talk about how CloudPath can help with deploying and provisioning client certificates if you are using 802.1x with eTLS. We'll also talk about how CloudPath can help with deployments in use cases such as multi-dwelling units, or MDUs. So where you want to actually provide functionality like private networks, so that each individual resident or residence itself can actually have its own, basically its own private VLAN that they can connect devices to using the dynamic pre-shared key. And the goal is obviously to help to sort of improve your understanding of how our controller platforms and CloudPath work together to be able to achieve this improved level of security at the network edge. In terms of the full agenda, so we're going to firstly look at what some of the problems with using standard pre-shared keys are, what dynamic pre-shared key is, how it actually works at a high level. Due to the sort of time constraint, this is a fairly short session. Not going to go into too much of the actual technical detail, but at least give you a high-level understanding what the difference between dynamic pre-shared keys and standard pre-shared. CloudPath can help to reduce the complexity and the hassles associated with using multiple keys on the same SSID. Going to look at some of those multi-dwelling use cases, and then slightly more interesting bit, I'll just take you through some demos. So we'll be looking at things like, for example, what the CloudPath configuration is from a workflow perspective, what the Smart Zone configuration is as well to enable the onboarding and automatic provisioning of dynamic pre-shared keys. Then we're going to take a look at something that's fairly new that we started to release in fairly recent releases of Smart Zone, the data plane, and CloudPath itself as a total solution for taking dynamic pre-shared key scalability to the next level. And this is especially in large multi-dwelling unit type of deployments. And it's specifically about removing the reliance on VLAN. So we'll talk a little bit about that solution. And then we'll take a look at using 802.1x networks and how that process of when you're using client certificates, how CloudPath can actually help to make that simpler in terms of actually deploying those certificates onto client devices. And I'll follow that up with a short demo as well and a look at the configuration. And then just finish up with a couple of slides on additional information and a bit on the RUCKUS technical family communities. Laura, I guess you are probably going to act as sort of a Q&A mediator in the meantime. So if there's any questions that pop up that you think need answering, then feel free to just call those out for me.
Hi there. Yeah, absolutely. No problem. I can do that for you.
Okay, so just taking a quick look at the different types of security options available in Wi-Fi. So this is, connectivity from a client to an access point perspective. One that's, hopefully a bit less used. This first one is an open network. So this open network basically inherently has no authentication. It's typically using a captive portal to actually authenticate users to a network. It has no encryption. So that potentially means that, all the traffic can actually be sniffed. So anyone can actually use a wireless tool to capture the traffic that's unencrypted, sniff that traffic, and potentially glean information such as usernames, passwords, other personal data out of that. Now, today, most applications that you actually use over a Wi-Fi network will be encrypted at the application level using HTTPS. But nonetheless, it still leaves more opportunity for hackers to be able to, do some sort of vulnerability attacks on these open networks. So, generally they're insecure and shouldn't be used. And in fact, the Wi-Fi 6E, so that's where Wi-Fi 6 is extended to the 6 gigahertz spectrum, does not actually allow open networks to be used on it. So, it is something that you really should avoid using. The only specific use cases are typically when you are going to have a captive portal for performing some sort of process. So CloudPath, for example, uses an open network where clients are basically redirected to the CloudPath portal and go through an onboarding process. That all takes place in a simple HTTPS session. The second type is the pre-shared key. So this is what we're going to talk about, what you shouldn't be using. So whilst it does provide some encryption and some basically authentication process, it is something that is fairly easy to actually compromise. And the main issue is that all the people using that Wi-Fi network or that SSID are using the same key. So we'll look at some of the negatives of using the same key for all devices connecting to that network. So again, using a standard pre-shared key network is something that should be avoided wherever possible. But as I mentioned earlier, 802.1x is generally seen as the gold standard of authentication for networks, both wired and wireless networks, that is. It is built around a standard framework for exchanging authentication information and provides strong authentication, strong encryption as well. On the downsides, you do need a radius server, and in terms of CloudPath actually incorporates a radius server, but it can be used with 802.1x client certificates. And also the end devices require an 802.1x supplicant. Now, over the last few years, a lot of devices that didn't used to support 802.1x supplicants now do in terms of their OS and so on. But there are still, different types of devices which typically are more sort of terminal or terminal device, I guess, in terms of things like scanners for, maybe warehouses, for example. They may be ticket scanners at a public venue, and other types of systems, maybe like printers, so on, that actually don't support 802.1x supplicants, so they can't be used on the 802.1x network. And also, this need for having a client that supports 802.1x, having the radius authentication server, dealing with a protocol between a client and the access point, and the radius server itself, can add to a lot of extra complexity, especially if you're going to do EAP-TLS with client-based certificates, which is much stronger and better than actually doing EAP-PEEP, for example, which is just using username and password. If you're using username and password, kind of to a degree, whilst there are some benefits of .1x, you might as well be using an open network and a captive portal, because you have the same issues. If you're using username and password, they tend, there's credentials, they get shared, they're vulnerable to phishing attacks, to malware. People change their password, they write them down on a bit of paper. People's usernames is going to be typically their email address. So, using 802.1x with user credentials and the password is not really a very strong way of doing your security. If you're going to do .1x, you really need to do it with client certificates. And finally, I'm going to take a look at the dynamic pre-shared key. So, RUCKUS isn't the only vendor that has a dynamic pre-shared key solution, but as I say, we have been in this market for a long time. We were a very early adopter and kind of drove this market right in the early days of our zone director controller. So in terms of what the benefits of dynamic pre-shared keys are, that they are easy to use from a user perspective. They are easy to use, for example, from a user perspective and from a network admin perspective than implementing .1x with client certificates. You have the opportunity to self-onboard, so you can actually have the system create a dynamic pre-shared key, display it, create a QR code so people can scan that and actually automatically connect to networks. It can be emailed, it can be SMS to the user as well. So it's a very, very easy solution to use, but actually provides, a good level of security. So it provides, authentication and encryption on that wireless network edge. So not as good as .1x, but certainly a lot simpler. So let's take a look at some of the problems with standard pre-shared keys. So this is where the same key is shared amongst multiple users and devices on a wireless network. Firstly, that shared key is generally not going to be too long or too complicated, because if you've got lots of people using that same key, the more complicated you make it, the more problems you're potentially going to have, and help desk calls of people not being able to connect to the network because they're actually putting the key in incorrectly. So it's not very secure from that perspective, because that makes it a bit easier to guess, especially if people start to use things like the organization name followed by 123 or something similar to that. So, RUCKUS 123 is the pre-shared key, or guest 1234 or something like that. So, it doesn't take much of a dictionary attack, for example, to actually, guess what that PSK is. It's also then very vulnerable. So as some fairly recent attacks have actually shown, but it's easy to sort of brute force the actual key itself if you're actually capturing data over the air. As mentioned already, the key is shared with multiple people, and it's hardly ever changed. And the main reason for this is that when you change the key, you have to change it on all the devices connecting to that network. So it causes a lot of disruption to people and loss of connectivity potentially for some devices. So for that reason, the key is hardly ever changed, and that makes it more insecure. The longer it's actually used, the more insecure it becomes. So in terms of administration, it's kind of simple in terms that it's the same key that everybody uses for all their devices. One of the downside is that you can't easily set different policies for that key. So you can't, without overlaying some form of user authentication, potentially going back to a captive portal or some sort of authentication service, you can't set different types of policies to use with that key, because basically everyone's using the same key. So to the network, everyone looks the same. So you have to overlay it with some higher level of authentication and role-based access controls to be able to set different policies. As we mentioned, changing that pre-shared key requires all devices to have theirs changed as well to continue connectivity. So a lot of issues around using standard pre-shared keys. In terms of dynamic pre-shared key, so where this in essence is different to a standard pre-shared key is that it's an SSID that supports multiple pre-shared keys. So this is effectively where each user will have their own key with multiple devices, or each device will be assigned a key, so bound to each individual device. So this is where we move away from the concept of having a single pre-shared key for all users. Each user or each device has its own pre-shared key. This doesn't break standards in any way. It's all handled, to the wireless network, it looks like a pre-shared key. It's just that each device, stroke each user, has their own pre-shared key rather than the same pre-shared key that's shared amongst all the users. So in terms of when you assign a pre-shared key typically to a device or user, it actually makes it easier to audit the network connections as well, because now you have more visibility. So unlike the single pre-shared key being used by multiple devices stroke users, having an individual or a device pre-shared key means that you've actually got a much better audit trail of actually seeing when that device is connected and so on, and also being able to revoke that device as well individually without having to change the key for everyone. You can also apply policies specifically to those individual dynamic pre-shared keys. So that might be assigning keys to individual assigning individual DPSK to a particular VLAN, or groups of DPSKs to a particular VLAN. So in a school, typically that would be, different year groups would be assigned to different VLANs there. So that you get that segregation between the different year groups and their traffic. You can apply other policies like rate limiting, time schedules, which wireless LANs are actually allowed to be connected to using that DPSK, and other role-based access controls as well. So the actual control and visibility you get is much greater than with a shared pre-shared key, or standard shared pre-shared key, I should say. There are two types of dynamic pre-shared key that are supported by RUCKUS. So we have a bound dynamic pre-shared key, and this is where the pre-shared key is bound to a specific MAC address. And that key, it can either be pre-assigned when it's created to a specific MAC address, or if it's just distributed to the users, it can be bound to the first MAC address that is actually seen using that key. So that obviously becomes a little bit more random from that perspective. Something you've got to be aware of with bound dynamic pre-shared keys is that randomization, or MAC randomization, which is a feature of most OSs today, may cause issues with bound DPSKs that are bound to the MAC address. So if, for example, a user connects to a Wi-Fi network, they are given a dynamic pre-shared key, which is a bound dynamic pre-shared key. When they use that dynamic pre-shared key to connect to that Wi-Fi network, it becomes bound to their MAC address. And if that's a randomized MAC address, if they then go and forget that network and rejoin that network, it will have a different MAC address. So that dynamic pre-shared key will no longer be valid. So that's just something to bear in mind if you are using bound dynamic pre-shared keys, but MAC randomization may cause issues with that. And the solution to that, potentially, and a much better way of doing it, is to use unbound dynamic pre-shared keys, sometimes referred to as group dynamic pre-shared keys when you talk about, for example, the inbuilt dynamic pre-shared key feature on the Smart Zone controller. So basically, unbound is, as the name suggests, compared to bound, is that it's not actually a key that's bound to dynamic pre-shared key, but is bound to specific MAC address. So what this allows for is actually to have multiple devices actually connecting using that dynamic pre-shared key. So typically, this is a key which is going to be created for an individual, so for a user, and they'll actually be able to connect multiple devices. And this is where, for example, CloudPath adds value over using built-in dynamic pre-shared key creation and distribution in Smart Zone or Cloud or Unleashed, in that you can limit the number of devices that are actually using that group dynamic pre-shared key. So you may want to, for example, issue a group dynamic pre-shared key to all your residents of an MDU, and you want to limit it to 10 devices. So they can't connect any more than 10 devices, as an example. So unbound is basically not bound specifically to MAC address, so it doesn't suffer from this MAC randomization issue. So it's just a bit more of a graphical view of bound DPSKs. So you can see here on the left, let me just get my little pointer up here. So you can see on the left here, we've got some users that have dynamic pre-shared keys. And dynamic pre-shared keys, because they're bound, are bound within the dynamic pre-shared key database, are actually bound to a particular device effectively through their MAC address. So it's one key to one device, effectively a one-to-one relationship here. That said, you can have a user with multiple dynamic pre-shared keys, as we have here. So this user has multiple devices. So they've been given multiple dynamic pre-shared keys, and they are actually used for multiple devices. So that kind of makes it, it's not necessarily just that one user can only ever have one dynamic pre-shared key when they're bound. They can have multiple dynamic pre-shared keys actually assigned to them. So this user has 2 devices, so they have 2 dynamic pre-shared keys. You could have a user with 10 individual dynamic pre-shared keys. The issue with that is that you start to, the more dynamic pre-shared keys per user, for example, you start to get back to a little bit more complexity in terms of, having to manage all those individual keys per user. So you can, when you create them, you can assign a username to them. So you've got some visibility of who actually owns those dynamic pre-shared keys. But nonetheless, having lots of dynamic pre-shared keys per user, if you go back to that example of having 10 devices per MDU residence, and you've got 1,000 apartments across 3 or 4 tower blocks, then that becomes a huge number of dynamic pre-shared keys that need to be managed. So whilst it can work, there can be some use cases for it. Often it can make things a little bit more complex. So this is where perhaps unbound or group DPSKs is a better fit. So a user may just have one device, or they may have multiple devices, and they just have a single DPSK to onboard those devices. But we still get visibility of who the user is that's actually using that DPSK, but it just makes it a lot simpler because you have far fewer dynamic pre-shared keys effectively stored and having to be checked. So it's simpler from the user perspective. They've only got a single key to deal with, and it's overall simpler to track and monitor, and improve scalability as well. Oh, and I should just point out as well, I've kind of got here, we've got the RUCKUS DPSK network. So this is the secure WPA network that the DPSKs are connecting to. But I've got this RUCKUS onboarding network as well. And this, I've kind of grayed that out because you can create and distribute the keys manually. So whether you're doing that directly through SmartZone or Cloud or Unleashed, you can create those keys, distribute them. Or with CloudPath, you can create an onboarding SSID with a captive portal. So the client connects to the onboarding SSID, they're redirected to CloudPath. They typically go through an authentication stage or step so that you know who the user is when you actually create the keys, who it's actually bound to. And then they actually get the key created, and you can display it, email it, SMS it to the user, or show a QR code. So that's what I'll kind of illustrate in the demonstration. So it's not mandatory to go through an onboarding process. You can create your keys either on the controller or in CloudPath manually and distribute them. Or you can have the user go through an onboarding process, which means that IT isn't involved in the process at all. It's completely self-onboarding by the user, makes it very, very simple, and reduces help desk calls and basic time dealing with network access security. Taking a look at some of the scalability issues. So in SmartZone Controller, there's a limit of 25. If you're looking at Virtual SmartZone E Essentials mode or the SmartZone 144 clients, there's a maximum of 25,000 dynamic pre-shared keys per cluster. So whether you have 1 node or 4 nodes in your cluster, it doesn't improve scalability. It's still limited to 25,000 DPSK per cluster. And they can be bound or unbound DPSKs. And then you have a maximum of 5,000 DPSK per AP zone. That's actually quite a significant improvement, because up till 6.0, it was actually 500 per AP zone. So, that's a significant increase in scalability on the SmartZone in terms of the number of DPSKs that are actually supported per AP zone. And, for quite a lot of deployments, that will actually be sufficient. The issue with it is mainly that, on SmartZone Controller, there is no automatic or self-provisioning of DPSKs. It is a case of manually generating, so that's individual keys, or bulk generating the DPSKs and then distributing them manually to the users. So, in some cases, that's perfectly workable. In other cases, it's really just more hassle than it's worth. When we look at RUCKUS Cloud, it's 10,000 DPSK per tenant, again, bound or unbound DPSKs. And again, that is manual generation. There's no portal for doing that automatically. I haven't got Unleashed in here, and I can't remember offhand what the Unleashed scalability is. But given Unleashed is generally a per site model with a limited number of users, 2,000 users, it's not going to be a huge number of DPSKs. It's probably somewhere in that same region, somewhere in the region of 2,000 DPSKs, but I can't remember the exact figure. The thing with Unleashed is that you do actually, because it's kind of built on the zone director code, the old zone director code, you do actually get some onboarding or self-provisioning facility within that. So it's a slight improvement over SmartZone and Cloud, but you do get that self-provisioning option within RUCKUS Unleashed. So that's fine if using Unleashed. So maybe in things like kind of smaller schools and so on, it might be an option for doing that for BYOD networks. So really, to overcome those controller-based limitations, you need to use CloudPath, deploy CloudPath. Say it's virtually unlimited. I think we've tested in excess of 1 million DPSK on a system. So, as far as I'm told, is that there isn't really any limit. There's certainly no limit written into the software of the system. It's really just based on resources. But it's very, very scalable. So you've even got the largest of MDUs, multiple buildings, thousands and thousands of apartments. Then CloudPath can help you scale to that number of DPSKs compared to a controller method like RUCKUS Cloud or Controller or Unleashed. The options as well are more granular within DPSK. So when you're setting, for example, things like the expiration date and time, you've got a lot more options in there. The ability to control how many devices are actually using a shared DPSK or group DPSK as well. And then you have the workflows for creating self-onboarding for DPSKs as well. So, there's lots of benefits in using CloudPath rather than using the built-in DPSK features within the controllers themselves. So just taking a quick look at multi-dwelling units that I've mentioned, because within enterprise, DPSKs are very useful. So often they're used for BYOD networks. So you may have corporate network or business network, and then you will have BYOD network, and the employees can connect their devices to the BYOD network. So that's typical enterprise type of deployment, whether that's a school or some other form of business. But one of the big use cases for dynamic pre-share keys is MDUs, and the reason is that typically what you want to have with an MDU is a private network type of architecture. So that's generally built around VLANs, and each resident or each unit within a residency of MDUs will typically have their own dynamic pre-share key and have a VLAN tied to that dynamic pre-share key. And what you can also do is, you can specify what that dynamic pre-share keys VLAN is, and you can also tie the wired network to that. So that whether they're using wireless or they're using wired network, effectively everything is within their private network. And what they can actually do is to roam freely as well. So it's not that they can just use that dynamic pre-share key with their devices within their residential unit. What they can actually do is to roam to other parts of the site that are also covered by the same Wi-Fi network, have the same SSID, and still basically be within their private network. So that's using the dynamic VLAN feature that allows them to basically roam around and keep access to their private network. So if they have any devices within their residential unit that they need to control remotely, or they may want to remotely print something, so they may go off somewhere to a cafe or a bar, be doing some work and actually want to print something out on the printer in their residence. Or it might be to control some sort of IoT device, something they, that's maybe IT or Wi-Fi enabled that they want to turn on or off, or change the temperature, whatever it may be. They can do that, because when they're remote and somewhere else within that campus, effectively, they can still access devices on their private network. And the key areas that we see for MDU and using dynamic pre-share keys, firstly, student accommodation. So we have some partners that play in this space. It's a growing business. There's lots more student accommodation being built and provisioned, especially around sort of college and university sort of towns. And it is a big growth area for us, with these partners. And this is where each student is going to be in the same accommodation for a number of years. They can be signed a dynamic pre-share key that's tied to their own private VLAN, and they have their own sort of private network that they can attach other Wi-Fi devices to, and manage and use those devices on that network. Then you have general residential apartments, and this is typically where partners want to get in with the the building contractors, or not so necessarily contractors, but even the people that are actually going to own the properties. Need to get there, work with those apartment developers to actually be able to specify having RUCKUS as part of a solution. So when you have a lot of apartments being built today. And even houses as well. So we have some housing providers that actually fully fit the houses like apartment providers do with Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi is just a service that actually comes with the apartment. And there's obviously different ways that they can monetize that. It may be kind of included as part of a rent. It may be a separate payment for having Wi-Fi and broadband access, whatever it is. But working with the developers and the builders of apartments and housing can be a good place to actually try and grow your business in terms of MDU. Another large growing area is assisted living. So again, it's an area where we've got several partners playing. There's some very large opportunities. You know, this may be care homes, so, you know, old, you know, sort of retirement care homes or assisted living. So it may be, you know, sort of apartments, it may be bungalow type of housing there. You know, it may be actual, you know, medical care type of you know, support. So it's not just necessarily because it's for, you know, for sort of retired and older people, maybe actually to do, you know, because of medical needs as well. But they need, you know, closer supervision. So, you know, lots of opportunity in there as well. I mean, I've got some, you know, I've seen some opportunities for some of these providers, but you know, but you know, are into the thousands of actual care homes, you know, of varying sizes. You know, some of them have a handful of residential units, other of them, you know, have hundreds of residential units in them. So a lot of, you know, a lot of opportunity in there as well to be involved with the providers of assisted living and different types of care homes as well. And then one we've had some success in both UK and some other territories as well is, you know, military barracks or military housing. These look, not my pictures, but these look pretty superb places if I was in the military to have as my military housing. They're more typically sort of barracks or, you know, terraced housing. Maybe I guess this is from the US, maybe they get a better standard of military housing there. But again, it's an opportunity working with those providers that you know, own the military housing to, you know, to put a Wi-Fi service in there enabled with you know, dynamic pre-shared keys and private networking, but using the same SSID across the whole site so that people can, you know, can have this mobility and still access their private network services. Just taking a look at some of the steps of deploying dynamic pre-shared keys with SmartZone and CloudPath. It's a very similar process whether you're using Unleashed with CloudPath or RUCKUS Cloud, but I've chosen to use SmartZone in this case as an example. So on the CloudPath side, first thing you need to do is to create your dynamic pre-shared pool. So a pool is effectively, you know, a pool of dynamic pre-shared keys that may be applicable to, you know, a particular building, a particular site. You know, it may be a particular user community. So in a school, it might be you have a DPSK pool for staff and a different DPSK pool for students, for example. But basically, a pool contains the DPSKs and the parameters. When those DPSKs are generated, they specify the parameters and policies associated with the DPSKs within that pool. You then, if you're going to actually use an onboarding workflow, you then create an onboarding workflow. So as I said, you can manually create the DPSKs directly in the pool and distribute them manually if you want to. But in most cases, you'd actually want to have an onboarding workflow in CloudPath. Then you also need to gather information about the Radius server. So the Radius server in CloudPath itself, you need to get its IP address and the secret that's actually going to be used, because the SmartZone controller is going to use that as the authentication service for the DPSKs. And you also need to get the workflow URL as well. So when you create the workflow for onboarding, it has a specific workflow URL generated. You need to use that for the redirection in the SmartZone hotspot network. And say if you're not using onboarding, then at this point, once you've done this creation within CloudPath, you can generate the DPSKs manually if you want to. On the SmartZone, basically what you're going to do is you're going to define a Radius server profile, which is basically pointing to CloudPath. So it's pointing to the IP address using the shared secret from the CloudPath configuration. And you're also going to, or sorry, I should say, you can either define it up front as a profile, or you can define it when you're actually creating the DPSK network. So entirely up to you. You can actually do it within the flow of the network creation. You're going to add the onboarding wireless LAN. So this is basically the type, it's a Whisper hotspot captive portal wireless LAN that's used to onboard. Basically, what this does is to redirect the user when they connect to it, to redirect them to the CloudPath captive portal so they can go through that onboarding journey and generate a DPSK. And to do this, you need to use the workflow URL from CloudPath, we gathered from CloudPath, and also the Radius server profile that was created either in the wireless network or separately within the authentication services. And then you're also going to add the secure network, so the WPA network that uses the external DPSK service of CloudPath. And again, you'll be using the Radius server profile for that as well. So basically, when you're using the onboarding hotspot and when you're using DPSK, they're both talking to CloudPath as a Radius server. So let's take a look at the demo then here. So let me stop sharing this and just share my screen. Right, go there. Let's just point out. So the steps I'm going to show you, or the portions I'm going to show you in this demonstration for DPSK with CloudPath. Firstly, so I'm just going to take a look at the CloudPath and Smart Zone configuration, rather than actually doing one live and waiting for things to be provisioned on the APs and so on, which can take a couple of minutes. Sometimes I've kind of pre-configured it, but I'll walk you through the configuration, both in CloudPath and Smart Zone. Then I'm going to generate a DPSK manually, so you can see how that's actually done within the DPSK pool, and use a device to connect using that DPSK. And then I'm going to actually go through a workflow showing you how you can actually, from a user's perspective, what that workflow would actually look like to actually automatically generate the DPSK for you. Okay, I guess that's going to minimize itself in a moment, hopefully. So Laura, I just want to check, are you seeing my Smart Zone controller screen now?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so it should have at the top left, it should say virtual Smart Zone.
Yeah.
My mouse is pointing good.
Yeah, that's all on there.
So let's start off with CloudPath first. So this is probably going to just need to log back in again. Bear with me 1 second. So various contexts, it's fairly easy to navigate around CloudPath. This isn't really going to be a full CloudPath tutorial, so I'm not going to go through all the different contexts and so on within CloudPath itself. But let me just start with configuration. So the first thing you need to actually do is to create a DPSK pool. Since you've got various pools here that have been used for various other events and so on, but this is what I'm using here, this top one DPSK pool. So if I just click on this to look at the details of it and click edit, we can just see some of these are some of the controls and policies are actually assigned to any DPSKs created within this pool. So just at the top here, it's got the name DPSK pool. Not too worried about this other stuff. I can specify how long the DPSKs are going to be. So, you don't, unless you're going to be automated for provisioning using QR code or actually using a provisioning step within the workflow, you probably don't want to make this too long. Sort of typically 8 to 12 characters as the length of the DPSK is normally sufficient. You can go to more of that if you want. You've got various different forms that you can actually have a DPSK created in. So you can have just uppercase, lowercase, mixed case. It can be alphabetic, just alphanumeric, just numeric, or random ASCII. So when the DPSK are created, you can either specify what the DPSK is if you're actually manually creating a DPSK, or you can just let the system randomly generate you one based on what you select here. So I'll just leave that as numeric. Then you can specify what SSID or SSIDs the DPSK is applicable to. So again, this helps to limit the scope of people trying to connect or being able to connect to the wrong network. So they'll only be able to connect specifically to this network here, this secure network here. You can specify expiration for the DPSKs, and again, you can override all this stuff on an individual DPSK basis if you're creating them manually. So this is, for example, again, where you get more granularity than you do in a Smart Zone. So you can select a specific date that it's going to expire on. You can select in how many minutes, hours, days, weeks, months. You can specify that it's going to expire at the end of every quarter or every year, the end of every hour. So lots of different options for when the actual DPSK is going to expire. So entirely up to you what you set that to. And if you want to, working on the basis that these are actually going to be, group DPSKs or unbound DPSKs, you can specify, how many devices can actually use this particular DPSK, or each DPSK that's created in the pool, I should say. And then what you can also do is specify policies. So on the left here, you see there's a context here for policies. This is where you define all the policies. So what you can actually do is to create policies but based on things like whether it's the DPSK pool, whether it's the user email address, whether it's the group, the authentication group that a user belongs to when they authenticate, when they're onboarding. So all sorts of different parameters that you can actually use to apply policies. So I've just got a couple of simple policies here. I've basically got one which is based on a group. So if a user, when they authenticate, belongs to VLAN 1, then they will be placed into VLAN 1 automatically. Their devices will be placed in VLAN 1. And then I've just got a default fall-through policy, which has got nothing attached to specify. So it's kind of like the fall-through. It's a default accept rather than a reject here. So basically, if you don't match or you're not a member of that group, then you'll be placed into VLAN 10. So, so just a little example of how you can actually attach policies to these DPSK pools as well. And those policies are basically any radius attributes that are supported. So it might be things like rate limiting that you include there as well. It could be things like time schedules and stuff like that as well. So, lots of things that you can actually include in those policies. So let me just cancel that. I'm going to save those changes. So that's what the DPSK pool looks like. Within here, you can also see the DPSKs that have been issued within that pool as well, and then I can click on these to get more details about them. You can also see, for example, what the usage count as well. So you see here that there's one device using it and it's unlimited. So I think all these ones have been created are unlimited, yeah. So you can see, if any devices or how many devices are actually using that DPSK as well, if you've got a limit on it there. And then these are just the radius policies where I can actually make the assignments to the policies and actually test them as well. So I can evaluate the policies work as well before I actually deploy this workflow. So creating the DPSK pool and its attributes and policies is the first step. The second step is then to create the workflow. So under configuration workflows is where I create the workflows. Again, there are a number of workflows on here created by different SEs for different webinars and so on and testing. So this is what I'm using, this workflow here. And so I'm not going to take you through all the tabs and all the features of CloudPath, but the enrollment process is going back to the old days. I've been in IT for such a long time. So the old days of when you had the first kind of word processors that gave you what you see is what you get. So effectively you saw on the screen, rather than just having, typing text, you actually saw what the page layout would actually look like with the different fonts, different font sizes, colors, whatever it may be. So, I kind of apply that to this, this workflow and the enrollment process. It is effectively, what you see is what you get from a user perspective. So the admin creates the workflow and the steps in the workflow. And that's exactly the experience that the user will have when they run this workflow through the onboarding wireless LAN. So these are the steps they'll go through. So at the top of it, I've just got a terms and conditions. So this is what we call an acceptable use policy. So this is terms and conditions. So the user has to accept the terms and conditions before they can continue onboarding to get a dynamic pre-shared key. Then I'm going to prompt the user to do an authentication, because what I want to do is I want to know who the user is that's actually created the DPSK and what devices they're using. So to have that audibility, what you want to do is to actually prompt the user to log in. So that can be from the local database, which is just mainly used for testing. It's got limited scalability within CloudPath, but typically that's going to be externally. It's going to be Active Directory. It could be Radius. It could be LDAP. It could be Google authentication. It could be Azure AD. So all those different forms of external authentication are supported. Then once the user's been authenticated, then I'm actually given the choice. So the reason I'm given the choice rather than going directly down to the DPSK part here and provision a DPSK is that later on we're going to talk about 802.1x and certificates. So I've got a branch in here that just prompts the user, do you want to deploy, generate and use a DPSK, or do you want to deploy and provision a client certificate if you're using .1x? So normally you wouldn't have this option within your workflow. I've just got it in my demo here so that I can use both of them and show you how they sort of work and differ. So going down the DPSK track here, we've got generate a DPSK step. So this is basically creating a DPSK with the parameters specified by the pool within that DPSK pool. So that's the name of the pool that we looked at earlier. And then I'm going to display a message. So this is actually going to display the DPSK itself. And it's also going to generate and display a QR code that I can scan on a device and automatically have that device connect to that secure network using the DPSK that's being created. So from a user perspective, makes it even easier. They don't actually have to connect to the Wi-Fi network on a device that has a camera. They can just scan the QR code and it basically connects them using that DPSK. The other step I will just show you if I edit this particular step here, or we have a point in here, is that in terms of notification, I'm sending an email notification, we'll look at that as well. So when the DPSK is created, the user that's registered, or the user's email that's registered in the authentication database will also be sent an email with that DPSK so they have a record. So that's really the key parts of CloudPath in terms of the workflow that's going to be followed by the user. The last step, as I mentioned, is that you need to gather some, oh, sorry, I should get the first part is in here. So in the workflow, the first part of the information that you need to gather, if you're going to be using the onboarding, onboarding Wi-Fi network, is that you need the enrollment URL. So this is basically the URL that is for this particular workflow. So you put this into the Whisper Hotspot redirect URL in the Smart Zone configuration, be the same for Cloud and Unleashed. And when the user connects, they'll be redirected to this URL, which is effectively on this CloudPath service. And it's specifically this workflow here that I'm using. So that's one piece of information that you actually need when you're configuring the Smart Zone. And the other bit is from the Radius server itself. So this is where you need to have the port name that's being used for Radius authentication and also the shared secret. So that will show you the shared secret there as well. So you need those two bits of information along with the IP address of the CloudPath server. So you need those effectively 3 bits of information to configure the authentication service in Smart Zone. So that's all on there. So if I go to my Smart Zone controller here, so I'm under security authentication services. So I've created my authentication service. So this is it here. So if I just open this up, this is basically the authentication service that's going to be used for when the Smart Zone is authenticating the DPSKs to CloudPath. So I've got the IP address. So that's the IP address that corresponds to that training CloudPath server I'm using. Got the port and a shared secret entered in there. And it's configured as a Radius server because that's what what protocol CloudPath is actually using for checking DPSKs and also client certificates as well. So you create the authentication service, and then under your networks, you have your wireless LANs. So I've got 2 wireless LANs. Let me just take a look at these. So I've got the first one is the onboarding wireless LAN. If I take a quick look at this configuration, this is a hotspot Whisper wireless LAN. So basically what it's going to do, it's going to use a hotspot service, which is down here, specified down here, to redirect users to CloudPath, the onboarding workflow in CloudPath. So if I just click on this, I can actually see the parameters. So this is that URL that I talked about, that I copied from CloudPath. There's the URL there. The only other thing that you actually need here is some walled garden entries as well, depending on what you're doing. So we have some predefined lists that you can actually import as a CSV as walled garden entries, but that's pretty well all you need in the hotspot part of it. So basically all this is, it's an open wireless LAN. When the user connects to it, it uses this hotspot service effectively. It redirects the user to that URL so they can go through the onboarding journey. And the other thing, of course, that is also tied to the authentication service. So this is actually that, that authentication service, which is pointing to CloudPath there as well. So that's the onboarding wireless LAN configuration. And then we also have the secure wireless LAN where you actually use the DPSK once it's been generated. So this is just set up as a WPA2 encrypted network. And under DPSK, I've got it set to external so that it can use CloudPath. And then in terms of its authentication service, I'm pointing it to that CloudPath authentication service. So again, pretty straightforward configuration of that DPSK network. So when users actually try to connect to that or to this secure network, they need to enter a valid DPSK, and that will be checked to the CloudPath server to make sure that it is actually a valid DPSK. So that's all really that we need to look at in terms of the configuration side of things. So what I'm going to do now is just go back to CloudPath and actually just go back to the pools and create a manual DPSK and have a device actually connect to it. So let me go back to the pool here. If I look under DPSKs, if I wanted to just manually create DPSKs, I could do it. And you can create multiple, you can import a CSV if you use a feature known as managed access. So if you want to create a spreadsheet with tens or hundreds of or thousands even of DPSKs that are predefined, you can actually do that as well. But here, all I can do is to add a single DPSK at a time. So I'm going to give this user a name. Just a random name there. As you can see here, if I wanted to, I could actually, overtype the system generated DPSK, and we're using 8 characters, remember, and just numeric, but I'll keep that just so that I remember it. So I'll stick it in there so that I remember it when I connect my device. And again, here, if you want to, you can actually start to override things. So if I wanted to, I could override the device count limit. So override for pool policies here if I wanted to. And I could also, override the VLAN here. So rather than using the default fall through VLAN, because I'm not going to authenticate this user, I'm going to specify that this user is going to go into the default VLAN when they use this DPSK. So that's kind of how simple it is to create the DPSK. And what I could now do is to share that DPSK with that user. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to connect to the, so you can see here, currently the device count is unlimited. And if we look on my Smart Zone controller and just go to wireless clients, go to my area. So you've got no wireless clients connected there. So let me just go to my phone here and connect to that RUCKUS dynamic pre-shared key SSID. And what was the password? Here we go. Fat fingers there. Let's try that again. And hopefully by magic, my phone will join. Of course, when you're doing demos, it never works like you want. Just cancel that, make sure I've forgotten this network. This network, why has it got private IP address again? Just turn that off. So I love doing live demos. Going on there. It all worked earlier, I promise, when I tried it. Maybe just VLAN 1, so that should all work. And I copied it over. So I have no idea why it's decided it's not going to work this time. I'll give it one more try. Oh, I don't know, fat fingers or whatever, but it is there now. So I am connected. So I'll just go back to and actually see now that this is being used by one device out of an unlimited count. And if I go to here and refresh, got my device connected, and you can see it's been placed into VLAN 1. It's an authorized device. So just a little example of using a predefined network. So let me just forget this one again whilst I go on to the next stage. So using a predefined DPSK, pretty straightforward. You just have to manually distribute those DPSKs, which makes it a little bit more awkward. So let me just forget that network. Just set it to using that. Okay. That should clear out. Yep, disconnected from that network. So what I'm going to do now is go through the onboarding process. And because I can't show you, I could mirror my iPhone, but I'd have to be on one network and then change to another network. So it makes it a bit awkward because I'll lose the connection and the screen mirroring. So what I'm going to do is there's a nice feature within the workflow. So when you're in the workflow itself, you can actually go through the workflow to basically emulate what the user experience is like. So you can basically, within the workflow, just click on the link for the workflow. And this is what the user experience would be like. So whether I'm connected on my iPhone, my tablet, or whatever it is, so I connect to the onboarding Wi-Fi network, and I'm automatically redirected to this captive portal that's hosted on CloudPath. So remember, the first step was to accept some terms and conditions. So you can obviously customize these to your heart's content. So I'm going to accept the terms and conditions. Now it's going to ask me to authenticate. So I'm just going to use, which one shall I use here? Shall I use that student one? Now I use this, sorry, this one here. I use this other user here. So whilst it says VLAN 10, they don't actually have a VLAN policy applied to them. So they'll just use the default fall through policy, just so that you can see a different VLAN is actually used. And this is where I said that you have the, I've put in the option for DPSK and certificates. And this is really just, it's not something you'd normally have within your workflow. It just gives you the option. So I'm going to select DPSK. And basically, it's created a dynamic pre-share key for me there. It's also emailed it to me. So let's have a look here, see if that's come through already. Oh, there it is. So you can actually see the emails come through there. And again, you can customize the content of the email. You can also put in a workflow step that will actually send it via SMS as well. So if the user enters their mobile phone number, you can have it SMS to the user. So that's pretty useful. They have a record of it there. And you've got the QR code. So what I'm going to do is to scan that QR code with my phone. It just pops up and says, join RUCKUS DPSK network. So you need to confirm on that. And all being well, that will just join the network as well. So if I now have a look back at, I can't get back to it. Let me just get back to my Smart Zone controller. If I refresh this, there we go. So we've got the device connected just by scanning that code. But notice this time it's going into VLAN 10 because I haven't specified the VLAN to be used, or I haven't used specifically a user within a group. It's just fallen through to using that default policy VLAN, which is VLAN 10. So pretty simple from a user perspective, whichever way you want to look at it. Just going to move that over there, move that out of my way. In terms of provisioning, you can also do an automated provision, so it will go off and actually provision the DPSK and that network SSID and security parameters on the device. That then brings into play a lot of other situations, as we'll talk about with certificate deployment and provision client certificates. So it's often easier to actually do it this way, where you're displaying the key, maybe displaying a QR code, and also emailing or SMSing the code to the user. So hopefully you see that's a pretty simple process from perspective of using CloudPath. And of course, you've got all customization here. You can customize obviously the logos. What actually goes into these workflow steps in terms of what's displayed to the user. The background, all that sort of stuff can be fully customized. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea there of automatically generating the DPSK and having the user use that DPSK to onboard, and seeing that it's actually tied to a particular VLAN as well, based on policies. Right, so let me go back to sharing my now. Okay, so just taking a little bit of kind of taking the DPSK solution to the next level. There's really two stages of this. So it's work that we've specifically done, one part on CloudPath. So we've added some features and functionality into CloudPath to take it to the next level, specifically in terms of large deployments, typically MDU type of deployments, or also taking it to the next level past that as a solution involving Smart Zone, the data plane, and CloudPath itself as well as a full solution. So let's take a look at these. So the first thing that we added, probably a good 15 to 18 months ago now, was this concept of property and tenant portals. So when we look at the terminology of this solution, so this is a CloudPath solution, so it can be used with Smart Zone, it can be used with RUCKUS Cloud. What you have is a property, so this is typically going to be aimed at those multi-dwelling unit type of deployments. You have a concept of a property, so that's it's a building of some sort that's owned by a property manager or a property management company, or it might be a set of apartment blocks, and for each apartment block you may have an apartment block manager within that. But you basically have a property which is a building, and you have have someone that looks after the the IT infrastructure overall across those buildings, who is the property manager or the unit manager. And a unit is effectively a residence within there. So there's a block of apartments, each apartment is a unit within there. And then the lowest level is the tenant. So you have the person, but it's actually the tenant, an individual or a family, or a military family, whatever it may be, or someone in care homes. And there's actually a tenant of that particular unit, and the unit belongs to a property. So you kind of have these terminologies or concept that sort of flows down from the property to the unit to the tenant. And basically there's a portal where the property owner defines the units, and then within the units, the DPSK is actually assigned to it, and the tenant can actually manage their own DPSK and even set up the DPSK for their guest users. So that's effectively where I'm showing here is the tenant portal. So the you can customize the tenant portal with a picture of the MDU, for example. You can do an announcement, sort of an announcement of the day or whatever it may be. There's a fire alarm test at 10 o'clock today or something similar. The tenant can actually go into their configuration and profiles and update them there. You've got the name of the tenant. So when a tenant is onboarded, so when they're added by the property owner, when they're added as a tenant, you basically put in their email address and or mobile number, and they'll receive, for example, an email which gives them a unique URL to actually access this tenant portal. So we know from the system who each tenant is as well. So again, this is designed for more longer term tenants. It's not designed for transient tenants that might, like hotels, for example, typically, but are just going to be staying, for a day or a couple of days or a week or so, or maybe a couple of weeks. This is more built around, longer stay tenants in terms of things like, apartment blocks or military residence, student accommodation, and so on. Basically, they have a unique URL to actually access the tenant portal, so they don't, there's no login or anything they have to do. They basically just need the tenant portal URL to actually connect to this tenant portal. And when they connect to it, what they can actually see is their own tenants there, so their own unit PSK there, DPSK there that's actually assigned. So they can actually view that DPSK if they want to actually onboard devices using it. They can bring up a QR code that they can scan to add devices to with a camera. And they can also change the DPSK as well if they want to. So if it's been compromised for some reason, they can actually change their own DPSK. So they've got the self-care for the DPSK. They don't have to go back to the IT person that looks after the properties or the units to actually change the DPSK. They can also see devices for actually using that DPSK. They can give them names as well, so it picks up some general information based on the MAC address of the device, but they can then specify particular labels for those devices. And if it's been enabled by the property owner through the property portal, they can also enable a guest Wi-Fi network. And that guest Wi-Fi network, they can again manage the DPSK for it. And they can actually, have the same VLAN as their own private network VLAN for their units, or they can have a different one specified where all the guests go into a different VLAN. So got that flexibility. So it's about this ability to basically allow the users to look after their own DPSK for their unit once it's been created. So it's a really, really nice solution for those larger, MDU deployments, but are for more longer term residents. The key thing about this is it's still using VLANs to provide that private network functionality. So, each DPSK is tied to a unique VLAN, and that VLAN can be automatically generated by CloudPath as well, which is another great feature of CloudPath. You don't necessarily have to manually assign the VLANs to each DPSK. You can actually have CloudPath automatically assign the VLANs. But of course, you do get to a limit of scalability of around about 4,000 departments. It's always going to be slightly less than that because various components in systems like the switches and the Wi-Fi network do typically reserve a few VLANs for specific functions. So you get somewhere in the region of about 4,000 VLANs that you could assign. And then you're going to have to kind of replicate the system again if you're going past that. So, if you've got 7,000 departments or whatever on the sites that are actually being looked after, you'd actually have to, kind of build this twice and split the site into half. So it makes things more kind of complicated. So a solution to that is something that we recently introduced. And so this is a complete solution based on CloudPath. It's also using the RUCKUS data plane. So the RUCKUS data plane provides tunneling of all the user traffic to basically a central location, basically to the core of the network. typically, and it also involves smart zone as part of that as well. The data plane is also going to be playing a part in terms of assigning DHCP addresses to all the clients and also providing NAT services if that's required, which it typically is. So it's going to assign DHCP addresses to the user devices, and it's also going to basically do NAT on those IP addresses as well out to the public internet. So this solution's mentioned, so it kind of utilizes these three components. You can't kind of substitute the data plane with something else or not have it. It's core to it, and the reason for that is that across that tunnel traffic, we're basically implementing VXLAN based transport and using virtual network identifiers. So for the dynamic pre-shared keys, it's still assigning dynamic pre-shared keys within CloudPath, but instead of a VLAN, we're actually assigning virtual network identifiers to that tunnel traffic so that we know, which user, which DPSK that traffic actually belongs to. So this is what basically gives it, huge scalability compared to using VLANs. So, it's potentially going to scale to tens of thousands of VNIs. I mean, I think that, per system, I think there are something like 16 million VNIs that you can use, but per system we're planning on increasing the scalability. I can't remember what the initial one was. I think it was 4,000, sort of in line with VLANs, was the initial system release, and the plan is that we're scaling that past tens of thousands, so that we don't have this same limitation as you do with VLANs for these very large MDU type of deployments. So a very, very scalable system in utilizing, all of the kind of key RUCKUS core components there. Oh, sorry, probably just a note there as well. So from day one, the system supports having wired AP ports traffic tunneled as well and participating in this. So if you've got, for example, H500s in each of these apartments, well, I should say, sorry, a little bit later, H510s or H550s in the apartments here, but say wall plate APs with 4 ports on it. When the user in that apartment plugs in, that's actually already provisioned to automatically use the same VNI. So basically, those ports look like the same part of that residence network as well, private network. And in the future, we're planning on adding the tunneling support to the ICX switches as well, so that it can also participate in this. So if you've just got an ICX switch in your apartment, so maybe like a small 8-port switch in each apartment, the resident will be able to plug into that, and that will also participate as well. So that's something we're doing in the future. So, it is a very, very scalable solution if you have any really large MDU opportunities. I was taking a look now at client certificates. So that's using 802.1x, which is, as I mentioned, the gold standard of authentication. And it's EAP TLS as opposed to EAP PEEP, which is using user credentials. So, again, it's about using CloudPath to simplify the deployment. There are various other solutions and means and ways of actually getting client certificates deployed onto client devices. But, overall, CloudPath tries to simplify that process. Unfortunately, it does come with a few warts nowadays because, the different types of client OSs, especially Android, have made it more difficult to automatically, it's not so much actually downloading the certificates to the client device, it's actually installing it into the certificate store. So it becomes a bit of a manual process. So we create the certificate apply policies, download it to the Android device, but the user then actually has to move that certificate into the client store. Similar on iOS, but a bit easier. It downloads it as a profile, and they just have to install that profile, which a lot of users are actually familiar with on iOS. So unfortunately, on some OSs, it's become a little bit more difficult than what it used to be. But nonetheless, it's still a lot better than trying to manually deploy client certificates without some sort of full PKI service for actually deploying certificates. The other thing, when CloudPath is deploying client certificates, it can deploy other certificates as well. So you can import certificates, which are most typically going to be certificates for HTTPS inspection. So it might be on a firewall or some sort of URL or content filter in your network. And basically, you have to push the certificate from that for man-in-the-middle HTTPS inspection. You have to push that out to all the clients. So not only can CloudPath provision the client certificates for .1x, it can also provision other third-party certificates onto those client devices as well. In terms of the controller, basically just creating an 802.1x wireless LAN. So pretty similar to what we saw before with the DPSK wireless LAN, but in this case, it's going to be an 802.1x EAP wireless LAN. And you're still going to have CloudPath configured as its radius server. So just like with DPSK, basically the smart zone controller is going to authenticate the users via CloudPath. So basically the certificate is going to be passed over the wireless infrastructure via the smart zone acting as a proxy to the CloudPath server using radius protocol and authentication. Now, CloudPath itself, you're basically going to have a workflow or a workflow step like I have, which is going to use something we call a device configuration profile. And that device configuration profile is effectively responsible for taking a certificate or client certificate template, creating that for this particular user, provisioning the SSID parameters, so the security level and which SSID is going to be used by that certificate. And it can also do some basic posture checking, but I'll talk about when I look into CloudPath as well. So it basically creates a package which is pushed down to that client device, and that's used to provision the SSID, the client certificate on it, security profiles as well, and can also do some basic posture checking. So it's not a full-blown NAC solution, but it can do some of that stuff. We do next year plan to actually do some closer NAC integration with some third parties as well for continual posture checking. The other thing about this as well is that provisioning process of that client certificate and profile can be done on site. So that's where the user device is provisioned and CloudPath will automatically try and move the user to that secure .1x SSID using their client certificate, or it can be off-site for pre-provision typically. So if you take the example of a college or a university, you could send the students for the starting a new year. You could send them a link in the enrollment letter and a QR code even, but basically as long as CloudPath is accessible to them, they can actually go through the provisioning process with their devices offsite before they turn up. So rather than have a flash crowd with thousands of users trying to sort of onboard via CloudPath on the first day of a new term, they could have actually already provisioned their devices, just turn up and that device will automatically connect to the secure network. And this is basically kind of that high-level topology, what it looks like. So, we are going to use an onboarding network in this case here, because we're going to actually automatically provision the client certificate. We've got the .1x network there, and then we've got the controller and CloudPath acting as the radius server there. And then each device basically is onboarded with its own unique certificate. And again, this isn't affected by MAC randomization because it's not tied to a MAC address. So a user may have multiple devices and multiple certificates. So let's take a look at the demo then. So we're just going to take a quick look at the controller configuration and CloudPath configuration for it. And then we're going to go through a provisioning workflow like we did for provisioning a dynamic pre-share key. But in this case, we're going to take it to the next step where it's actually provisioning that certificate and profile on the client device itself. So if I go back to my browser here. So let's start with CloudPath again. So some of the things that you need to create within CloudPath, first of all, is that when you install the system, it creates the certificates and so on that are used by the system itself. But what you typically have is a template. So a template is for different user communities. So we look at the templates. These are basically the certificate templates that are used to actually create the user or the client device certificates themselves. So these are where you can specify particular parameters on things like expiry, VLAN, and so on if you want to, or you can have those overridden by the system policy. So a bit like a DPSK, you can specify information within the DPSK, the DPSK pool, and you can have it overridden when you're creating actual individual DPSK. Same here, you can create policies within the certificate template and actually override them when a certificate is created if you want to. So you need to have a certificate template for the devices that are going to be using the certificates. And then within the workflow, what you're going to be doing is to actually be having a provisioning step. So this is where within my branch, I've got this option for displaying or displays for certificate onboarding instead of dynamic pre-share key. And this basically consists of two things. It consists of the device configuration profile that I mentioned, and we're going to take a look at that in a moment, and then also the certificate template that's going to be assigned to that user there as well. And again, you can have automatic branching within here. So what you can have is based on the user's authentication, they may come back in different groups, and you can automatically branch between different certificate templates. So you can have different policies for staff and students and visitors if you want to issue certificates to visitors. Or an enterprise, it could be different, certificate template policies for, employee devices, for employees, for BYOD, for contractors, and so on. So you can have these different templates with different policies assigned to them, and you can automatically branch based on the user's group membership when they're authenticating. But in this case, we're not doing that, so we just have a single certificate template, but we're actually using this device configuration. So if I click on this, it just takes me to configurations, device configurations. It gives me an overview of the device configuration here. But if I specifically go to the different tabs, so we've got the network. So what this is showing me is what are the network parameters that are going to be provisioned on that client device there. So what's the name of the SSID? What's the security level, encryption level? What type of SSID it is, what authentication methods, so we're using EPTLS here, and migration behavior. So I'm using offsite here because I don't want my client actually being provisioned. I'm going to do it on my laptop. I don't want it being provisioned and then automatically move to secure network, because then I'll lose my Zoom connection. So I'm just leaving it as only configure it, but don't try moving the user. So that's the network part of the configuration be pushed to the client. Then we have the certificates. So basically what we're pushing to the certificate is we're pushing the root web server certificate. So this is effectively the public certificate that's associated with this HTTPS site that you use as an admin. And then we're also going to push the certificate authority that's been created for this particular customer. So basically what CloudPath does is it creates an internal certificate authority with a root certificate, but is used to sign the client certificates with. So it basically pushes down the root certificate and the public certificate for the web interface, so you don't get certificate warnings when you actually go to the CloudPath captive portal. And if you have additional certificates you want pushed to the client, you can actually upload them here. And the last one is the NAC part of it. So this is where you can do posture checking when that client is being provisioned. So you can see we support all the major OSs that you're likely to get on a client perspective. One of the nice things is that you can actually specify what versions are actually onboarded. So you might say that you actually only want Windows 10 and newer clients to actually be able to onboard. So that's quite nice. You can specify what versions of OS can actually get provisioned. And you can also change the settings as well in terms of the NAC. So I'm not going to go through all these in detail. This is for Windows, of which there are a lot of settings, but you can do things like check for specific service packs. You can check to see whether things like antivirus is running. You can actually remediate that. So if it's not running, you can actually have CloudPath actually automatically remediate and enable the antivirus or enable the firewall or other specific software services and processes. You can change proxy settings, you can change all sorts of network settings on Windows as well. So there are a lot of settings that you can actually do on the Windows side of things, in terms of if that's sort of that posture checking. When you start to look at things like Mac OS and iOS, there's far few things you can do, but some of the things you can do is to enforce minimum lock screen security settings. So enforce on that client device if they're connected to your BYOD network, what the complexity and length of the passcode needs to be on that particular device. You can also set up proxy settings and active sync as well on Exchange on there. So you can do this posture checking as well when you're actually doing the provisioning of the device. So that's kind of the key bits and pieces that you need to actually configure in CloudPath. If we look on the Smart Zone, it's pretty straightforward. All you need to do, assuming that you've already got the authentication service set up, all you need to do is basically create your .1x network and point it to that authentication server, which is the CloudPath Radius server. So you can see here, it's just a standard network. It's enabled for 802.1x EAP. And then down here, I'm actually using that authentication service that I created earlier. So this is basically the Purdicom, RTF Purdicom, which is actually pointing to our CloudPath training server as a Radius server. So pretty simple again to set up, just like with DPSK for doing 802.1x based authentication. And if we go back to CloudPath, let's just actually take a look and see what this onboarding process actually looks like from a Windows user perspective. And it will look slightly different for iOS users and for Android users, Mac OS, but the kind of flow within the workflow is much the same. It's just the provisioning step that will be slightly different. So we've got our terms and conditions that we saw before. We're just going to authenticate users. So I'm going to use VLAN 1 for this user here, not that I'm going to connect. And this time I'm going to select certificates. I actually want to create and provision the certificate and profiles down to the user. So it's basically created. I can either download it as a zip file and run the executable within the zip file, or I can download the exe itself. So let me save the exe. And if you're not using posture checking, or most of the posture checking, you don't need admin rights to actually run this. It will actually do some of the posture checking. It's only when you get into the more advanced stuff, like if you want to check that the firewall is running and you want to do auto remediation on that, if it's disabled, you want to enable it, you need admin level configuration or admin level permissions on the laptop. If I show the log, so this is actually downloaded the configuration profile and certificate. It's going through the provisioning process that we can see here. So it's going to provision the SSID. So you can see here it says it's provisioned the SSID, and it's also provisioned a client certificate. So what I could do now is just go down to my wireless networks and actually click on this wireless network, and that will automatically connect to that wireless network using the certificate that has been provisioned and put me into a respective VLAN as well. So again, a pretty simple process from a user from a Windows perspective. So I'm not going to do that connection because I'll lose my connection briefly, and I don't want to lose the the Zoom session. So, provisioning process, pretty straightforward. And you could actually use this for DPSKs as well. You can actually use this provisioning process to actually provision the DPSK onto user devices as well if you want to. So nearly finished. I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint just to finish off the last few bits. In terms of additional info, a couple of links there. You'll get a copy of this presentation, so you'll be able to actually go and follow these links. You don't need to jot them down, but a couple of links. So YouTube video on using dynamic pre-share keys on SmartZone, and a best practice guide for CloudPath with external dynamic pre-share keys. A couple of useful reference links there. As I mentioned early on, RUCKUS isn't the only one that has dynamic pre-share keys of some form. So on Cisco, they're called IPSKs. On HP Aruba, they're called MPSKs, and on Extreme, they're called PPSKs. But they do have dependencies. So with RUCKUS, you can use dynamic pre-share keys directly on the controllers if you want to manually provision and distribute them. You don't need to have CloudPath necessarily. With Cisco, you do need to have Cisco ICE to be able to manage the IPSKs and create them. With HP Aruba, you do have to have ClearPass. It's not natively built into the Wi-Fi solution controller itself. And it's predominantly, with Aruba, it's predominantly used as part of Mac registration, which we can also do. Rather than using DPSKs, it has to be like a bound MPSK there. I'm not too familiar with Extreme's solution there, but it's basically what came from AeroHive. So everyone has their own kind of little flavor of this, and some of them have specifically, you do have to use their CloudPath equivalent. It's not built into the wireless LAN controller. We are planning as well in CloudPath supporting these within CloudPath as well sometime next year. Just something that if you're not already signed up, something you might want to go and sign up for or take a look around. Basically, if you go to this URL here, there's a link to take you to your local community, RUCKUS Technical Family Communities. So there you can do things like post questions. There is lots of bits of information. So at the top of here, you've got lots of information on RUCKUS technologies. You've got the communities, you've got the RUCKUS Technical Family Communities, and some other things there, things like the end-of-life products as well. So there's a lot of information at this particular link here if you want to go there. And we do support, whilst we're in the UK, we do actually support the RUCKUS Technical Family in over 20 languages for the local forums, and it is a moderated forum as well. So feel free to use these forums to actually go and share stuff that you learned, share information, the good, bad, and the ugly, how to do stuff and so on, or basically ask questions. Do make use of those forums.